Hey guys, I'm back. So things have been incredibly busy, and I haven't had much time to update. I actually debated updating you guys on what had happened to me recently. Just remembering everything is difficult enough, but sharing it is a whole other can of worms. The fact that I was an inch away from death really made it difficult for me to write down my latest experiences. But in the end, I thought that it'd better to get it out there in the open rather than have it fester from the inside. A lot's happened, and I want you guys to know. Some background before I get into things. It is currently every graduate student's dreaded nightmare, finals week. I was running on pure coffee and desperate desire to overachieve. If you're a student, this would probably sound all too familiar. And being that it was finals week, I had no time to humor Hector. Because he couldn't bother me as much as he used to, he had to turn to the next best thing. Even more Netflix binge watching. Hector moved on from sitting through sitcoms to watching movies, particularly action films. He's been very invested into the Mission Impossible franchise, which explained his incessant desire to own a motorcycle and experience a motorcycle chase himself, even though I insisted that kind of thing never happened in real life. Of course, being that he is a demon with no other empirical obligations other than to pay rent and eat fried chicken, he invested in one. With the money he earned from the Pollacks, Hector acquired a motorcycle. How he managed to get one, I have no idea. I didn't ask how he was able to get his hands on a seemingly new motorcycle without having a proper license or training, and I certainly didn't ask how he managed to get a forged license plate for his bike. All I knew was, he came back home with a lot of scratches and blood for a few days after trying to learn how to ride his motorcycle. I never planned on going anywhere near the bike, but of course I was proven incorrect. "We've got to go now," Hector said. He barged into my room as I searched for the mistake in my code, startling me. He was like a whirlwind going through my room in a frantic frenzy. He started throwing whatever clothes and shoes he could find lying around in my room into a duffel bag haphazardly. "Get ready, we're leaving in 10. "Whoa, dude, what are you doing? What's going on?" I saved my work quickly, knowing that ignoring him wouldn't work this time. Hector shut my laptop, tossing it in my duffel, and I got up from my seat. "That's my work." "Sorry, no time. I'll explain on the road. You're coming with me. Put on some clothes and meet me where I parked the motorcycle." Hector looked me straight in the eyes as he zipped up the duffel. He was already dressed in a leather jacket and ready to leave. "You know you can't just barge into my room and—" "I'm serious. We have to leave this place now." "Aye. Now, man." "Oh, okay, just give me 5 minutes." I reluctantly agreed, nodding confusedly. Hector didn't respond. He took the duffel bag, rushed out of the apartment, and slammed the door. Hector was never frantic. He had two moods at all times, sarcastic and hungry. The fact that he was freaking out like this was alarming. I took his words at face value and just went along with whatever was going on with him. I pulled on a jacket, grabbed my phone, and locked the door to our apartment. I met Hector at his bike, where he tied our bags down in the back and handed me a helmet. I'd never ridden a motorcycle before, so I hoped Hector knew what he was doing. He revved up the engine and set off on his mission to get us as far away from our place as possible. The rush of being a motorcycle passenger was strange, and I was pretty sure I was one adrenaline drop away from freaking out completely. Weaving through city traffic was a hassle, but we eventually made it to the border between the city and the outskirts of town. The sun was beginning to set in, which casted a nice red hue on the city skyline as we whizzed by on the highway, leaving the urban hustle and bustle behind us. Even through the tinted motorcycle helmet, I could see the rays of sun peeking through the buildings. It would have been a great sight to behold if we weren't presumably running away from something. The thrill of being on a motorcycle wore off quickly, and I found myself hoping Hector was as good as he claimed he was. His lack of a license or certification worried me greatly. He seemed to be driving pretty well despite not having a proper license, but I hoped he remembered I was mortal, and any motorcycle accident would hurt him temporarily and quite literally kill me. "So, what's the deal?" I shouted. The wind buffeting my ears made it difficult to hear anything. "What deal?" "Don't play dumb. You obviously didn't drag us out in such a rush to go on a peaceful road trip. What's going on with you? I knew I was dragged into whatever Hector was going through, and I wanted answers. Hector sighed audibly and cut off a few cars in an effort to rush to wherever he was going. His increasingly reckless driving was making me extremely nervous, and I hoped he had mastered riding his bike before taking me for a ride on it. Would you believe me if I said I wanted to act out a Tom Cruise car chase? No, I absolutely wouldn't. All right, remember how I told you I was kicked out of hell? Hector yelled back. Well, it's finally coming back to bite me in the arse. Elaborate, please. I remembered he had mentioned that briefly during the interview, but it wasn't something I really pondered over in my daily life. In fact, Hector never really mentioned anything about his life in hell if I didn't ask, and I didn't ask much. Hector was silent as he zoomed through the traffic. I nonetheless prodded on. I wanted a proper response. Is everything okay? Look, I'm going to be honest with you. Everything is not okay. Shit's hit the fan. The authorities caught on to the fact that I ran away, and they've managed to find my location. They've been on my ass since I left hell. They want to bring me back so I can go to what you humans would call a court hearing. How did they find you? I don't know. But I've been on the run for a bit. Before I saw your Craigslist ad, I was all over the place. At one point, I was walking through some desert in New Mexico because I literally had nothing else to do but avoid them. Gorgeous place, by the way. You should go sometime. Lots of sand, but if you're dehydrated enough, you can hallucinate yourself a pool of water. Hector. I cut off his attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere. Right, sorry. Anyway, I wasn't being entirely honest with you when I said I was kicked out of hell because I refused to eat humans. It's part of the reason, but it wasn't the biggest reason. What was the biggest reason? It's complicated. Well, we have a long ride ahead of us, don't we? Plenty of time to explain. Nah. We just have to get far away from the city enough to throw them off my trail. Found a place far away enough from the city for us to stay at for a few days. I don't know who tipped them off, but they know where you live, so the apartment's not safe for the time being. How do you know they're after you? My spidey senses were tingling. His sarcasm was insufferable. I reached around with my foot and kicked his shin. Ow. Fine. I saw them wandering around the neighborhood looking for me at all the fried chicken joints I hit on the daily. They're really obvious to spot, because they wear super obvious clothing to show off the fact that they uphold the law or whatever. But they can't be seen by humans. Anyway, I was on my way to Church's when I saw them. It's a good thing I saw them before they saw me, because that's when I knew we had to leave. But what if they chase you down? If they manage to track you down to our neighborhood, they can probably track you to wherever we're going. They're not entirely omniscient, that's the thing. It's not like they have a tracker on me. All the information they get is entirely crowdsourced. I don't know how they tracked me to the city, but it's not like they have the ability to instantly show up wherever I am. And if it took them that long to locate the neighborhood, it's going to take even longer if we're away from where they thought I was. I paused. Why don't you just go to your court hearing, man? You're really going through all this just to evade the law. I like avoiding my problems. Plus, it's what Tom Cruise would have done. Tom Cruise gets paid to pretend like he's being chased. He's not actually a fugitive like you are, and isn't running away just making everything worse for you. It seems like you're already in some pretty hot water with your authorities. I don't know how it works down there, but up here, you get worse sentences for running away from your hearing. Not if you don't get caught. And I don't plan on getting caught. That's why we're running. Hector's idea of running was going to a remote area to hide out, and a few miles on the outskirts of the city was all he needed to feel safe. He found a quaint motel on his Maps app and directed us there. When we arrived at the motel, the only source of light was from the full moon and the motel's flickering neon sign. It was small and looked a little run down, but it had a nice, rustic feel to it. The small motel faced the brilliant lake in front of it, and the moon's rays reflected off the choppy waves of the cold water. Hector tossed me my duffel, grabbed his own, and went inside. We checked into a room fairly quickly. Not many rooms were occupied, despite the fact that it was a Friday night. The room was pretty standard. 2 beds, a TV, microwave. But what set the motel apart from others I had been to were the full-length windows that slid open and led into the lakefront. I set my duffel down on the bed and grabbed my laptop to settle into the desk by the window. I still had homework to complete. Hector may have been worried about going to hell prison, but I was worried about passing my classes and getting a decent score on my finals. Shit, I left the phone in the bike, Hector grumbled as he pat his jeans. I'm gonna go back out and grab it. Can you grab my water bottle while you're at it? I think I left it in there too. Got it. Before leaving, Hector turned to me. By the way, don't leave this room, all right? The authorities won't be able to find us all the way out here, but like I said before, things from my world are hyper-aware of your presence and we're out of your comfort zone. Creatures in your neighborhood know what's up, but creatures around here think you're fair game. Yeah. I waved him off. Hector sauntered outside as I opened my laptop to find Wi-Fi so I could work on my coding project. Just because Hector was running away from demon cops didn't mean I could sacrifice my GPA. Besides, it was nice being away from the city for a little bit, even if it wasn't exactly for vacation reasons. I cracked the window open a little. The breeze from the open window felt nice as I continued trying to find the mistake in my code that was keeping my program from running smoothly. A few moments later, I heard a splash. I looked out the window to see a child-sized figure emerging from the lake. It was puzzling to see a child alone so late at night without any parental supervision that I could see, so I leaned in closer and squinted. As if they sensed my gaze, the child turned around. The moon illuminated the water, which reflected back on the child. It was a little boy, couldn't have been more than 10 years old from his appearance. And even though it was the middle of winter, he was only wearing swimming trunks and goggles, as if he was about to go swimming in the freezing waters at 11 at night. He looked as if he was having fun in the cold waters, like it was a warm summer evening. The child smiled back at me. He waved his hand as if to say, "Come play with me." I felt unsettled. Who was this kid, and why was he by himself in the middle of the night on a cold winter lakefront? When it became clear I wasn't going to go outside, the child frowned and turned away from me. He looked back once more and fell backwards into the lake and disappeared completely in the blink of an eye. In a moment, his body resurfaced, and I saw his limbs begin to thrash around in a panic. The next few seconds whizzed by. I jumped up from my seat out of pure instinct. I shoved Hector's warning to not go outside to the back of my head. I wasn't going to let a child drown because of his parents' negligence when I could do something about it. I had almost drowned as a kid, and it wasn't a fun experience. I slid the window open and ran outside to where the splashing was. The kid's limbs continued to thrash, and I hoped to God I could make it on time. In hindsight, I should have known something was off. I really should have just ignored the fact that there was virtually no practical explanation for a young boy playing in a cold lake in the middle of winter. The moment I reached the lake, the thrashing immediately ceased and there was no sign of the boy. But as I approached the boundary between the water and dry ground, I realized something was very, very wrong. Instead of a boy, I saw various grey faces floating beneath the surface of the water. They were entirely disembodied. The faces weren't connected to a body, or even a neck that I could see. They were just heads. The faces' eyes were all closed. But, the moment I was a step away from going into the water, the eyes shot open and they all focused at me. That's when I knew I had truly fucked up. Shit! Finn! I whipped my head around to Hector, fully prepared to dash back to safety. In a flash, I felt something slimy grip my ankle and wrist. The last thing I saw before I was pulled into the lake completely was Hector dashing towards me, looking perplexed. I should have listened to him. When I woke up, I was back in my room, my head throbbing. But I wasn't in my room back in the apartment. I was back in my childhood home. Had I been carried back to my parents' house? And how long had I been out? It was clearly nighttime. All the lights were out, and all I could see from my window was darkness. The moon was the only source of illumination, with the bare branches of trees creating eerie shadows in my room. The alarm clock next to my bed read 1 a.m. This was weird. How had I ended up back here? My twin-sized childhood bed suddenly felt restrictive, and I wriggled myself out of my sheets. I felt my way through my room to find the light and turned it on. To my surprise, everything looked somewhat normal, just the way I left it when I moved out. My closet was pretty much empty, and my old superhero posters were still hanging onto my fading walls. The ceiling was still plastered with glow-in-the-dark stars that I got for my 10th birthday. The normalcy of everything threw me off. Hadn't I just been pulled into a lake on the outskirts of the city? Feeling more than a little unsettled, I tiptoed out of my room. The hallway was dark, and my parents' room was closed. The tap from the sink in the bathroom dripped steadily, as if someone forgot to turn off the faucet completely. I looked down the stairs, reluctant to move around in such a creepy atmosphere. "Hector?" I called nervously. No response. I gulped and tried again, speaking up a little louder from the top of the stairs. Maybe he wasn't here, but hopefully my parents were. Mom? Dad? As soon as the words left my mouth, the light in the kitchen turned on. I breathed a sigh of relief. My parents always did have a habit of staying up late and snacking as they watched TV. Sometimes they'd stay up until 3 on weekends watching old movies. A faint blue glow came from the living room, along with some canned laughter, indicating my parents were watching something. "Are you up, Finn? We're down here, honey. Come join us." My mother's familiar voice put me at ease, and I made my way down the stairs. As I walked down, I noticed that the pictures in the stairway were altered in a strange way. They were lined with our usual family photos, but in every single one, I was crossed out vigorously with black Sharpie. In the last photo leading to the living room, I was ripped out of the photo entirely. This made me incredibly anxious. What on earth was going on? I gingerly approached the living room to find my parents sitting and facing away from me, fixated on the television. I was immediately appalled by the contents of the show they were watching. It seemed to be a black and white movie, complete with a grainy screen and muffled audio. The TV was on a strange loop, constantly repeating a scene in which a man was getting decapitated on a guillotine, blood gushing everywhere, with canned laughter running in the background at the most inappropriate times. At times, the TV would fizz out into a woman calling out for help, only to revert back to the guillotine again. What the hell are you guys watching? This wasn't right. My parents were the types to watch vintage films, Hallmark Christmas movies, and rom-coms, not gory horror movies. In fact, my father was hemophobic, and the very mention of blood was often enough to make him feel sick inside. He could not have been watching this without an upset stomach. My mother slowly turned to me, but something about her was off. Her closed smile was too wide, too plastic to be my mom. Her eyes looked as if they had trouble focusing and had a milky, yellowish hue to them. Her movements were too stiff and rigid, almost as if she was being controlled remotely like a toy. My father's head turned to me slowly as well, and he grinned as he locked eyes with me, revealing a set of sharp, pointy yellow teeth that I could only describe as anglerfish-like. "Welcome home, son," I screamed and backed off. My parents remained glued to the couch, both sporting the same creepy smile. Their faces and bodies began to melt, leaving only saggy, wrinkled skin with those ugly teeth and dead fish-like eyes. They cackled, and I realized they didn't even sound like my parents anymore. The living room was melting along with them. The wallpaper was peeling from the walls, and what was left of my melted parents was quickly becoming one with the melting couch. I made my way to the kitchen to try and get away from this insanity, but in my frenzied attempt to run away, I tripped and fell on my ass ungraciously. As I scanned the room for what I had tripped over, I saw a familiar face, the woman with the twisted limbs from the subway incident. This time, she was missing the bottom half of her body. Her intestines were falling out behind her. She was crawling towards me at an ungodly speed, reaching out with her trampled fingers to grab at my ankles to keep me from escaping. I didn't know how the hell she had ended up in my house, but I wasn't having it. I scrambled away from the kitchen and scanned the house for my two options. Either I could run back upstairs, or I could lock myself in the basement. I remembered the creepy photos on the staircase and opted out of the former, not wanting to see those strange photos again. I quickly dashed to the basement, yanked open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. I breathed heavily, but that wasn't even the end of it. As soon as I was able to catch my breath, a frantic series of knocks came from behind the door. I grabbed at the handle to keep anyone from the outside from opening it. "Finn, why won't you open the door?" Amy's titillating, psychotic voice wafted through the doorway. When I didn't respond, she began banging the door, jiggling the handle, and repeating the same inquiry over and over again. I put my hands over my ears to drown out her voice, the sound of my heartbeat overpowering her crazed threats. She was wailing at this point, slamming the door with her fists from the other side, and crying about how she just wanted to marry me and how I was making her so miserable by rejecting her. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the door back, demanding for her to shut up. Her wails ceased at once, and I was left with an uncomfortable silence. After so much noise, the silence was deafening. I let go of the handle, hoping she wasn't there anymore to open the door. I needed to find a way out of this madness. The basement was dark, so I turned on the emergency red lights, hoping I could find a hole or window to crawl out of. I regretted it instantly. The basement was otherwise empty, except for a lone figure standing by herself with a table and butcher knife in front of her, chopping away at animal parts with a satisfied smile on her face. It was Naomi, wearing an apron and surgical gloves. She grinned, revealing the same set of anglerfish-like teeth that I saw in my parents. "So nice of you to join us, Finn," she said, blood spattering her clothes and her face. "It's always so lonely down here in the basement." Naomi revealed what she was working on, a grotesque abomination of a taxidermized cat, made from different cat body parts. It had the head of a tabby and the body of a calico, mismatched legs of different sizes, and a tail that clearly didn't belong. The taxidermy stared me down with dead yellow eyes. Naomi made no motion to move towards me, but I screamed anyway and ran back up to the top of the stairs. She continued to chop, and her figure was beginning to melt just like my parents did in the living room. I heard the wails of cats echo throughout the room, and her crazed giggles as she melted away. As soon as she melted into a puddle, something bubbled from what was left of Naomi. The bubbling became louder and more insistent, and a hole burst forth with water. I held my breath. The steady trickle of water began to multiply in other areas of the floor of the basement, and I found myself inching further and further away as the water pooled to cover the entire surface area of the floor. The basement was flooding with water. I looked side to side for any escape, but to no avail. I even tried opening the basement door despite knowing what was on the other side, but it wouldn't budge. For some odd reason, the basement door was locked completely, and there were no windows I could climb out of. I was effectively trapped. Even if I waited at the top of the stairs, I knew that it was only a matter of time before the water reached me. And if I broke open the door, there was no telling that whatever was on the other side of the door was any less terrifying than death by drowning. I had nowhere to run. I mentioned I had no idea of what would happen to me in the last installment, and it was because I was never prepared to be thrust into a situation where I would have to come face to face with my darkest fears. I never felt as close to death as I did in that very moment. I could feel all hope beginning to leave my body. I realized whatever I was going through was my worst nightmares, and all my fears were manifesting themselves in an acid trip-like hallucination. There was nowhere for me to go to escape this hellish nightmare. I just wished I had thought before I acted upon a clearly nonsensical situation. There was no logical explanation for a little kid to be swimming in the lake in the middle of winter. I should have known it was an otherworldly trap. I should have listened to Hector. My carelessness was truly catching up with me, and this time I'd die for it. I crawled into a fetal position at the top of the stairs with my back facing the door, trying to come to terms with my impending death. I'd heard drowning wasn't so bad. I heard it was quick, mostly painless, just cold and empty and incredibly lonely. I hoped that was true, because that was ultimately what was awaiting me. The water was rising at an ungodly speed. I shut my eyes, preparing for the worst. In an instant, the basement door opened, and I tumbled backwards. I scrambled up desperately, wondering when Amy had come back to open the door, But to my relief, all I saw was Hector, as he had been when he was fake exorcising Mabel, in all his half-demon glory. Hector! I was extremely glad to see him for once. While his half-demon form normally put an uneasy feeling in my chest, it was more than a welcoming presence in the moment. Dude, we can't stay here. You have to wake up. I paused in my hysterics. What are you talking about? Do you have any idea how to get out of here? Hector glanced at me for a moment, then at the door, and then at the basement water quickly rising to the top of the stairs. It was only a matter of seconds before we'd be caught by the water. You're going to hate me, Hector sighed. But you're not going to wake up if I don't do this. What? Hector's gnarled hands shot forward and pushed me. Sorry in advance. Hector shoved me down the stairs directly into the water. I felt myself hit the water head first and immediately submerge inside the freezing temperatures. In a panic, I screamed, and water went up my nose. Why the fuck did Hector shove me into the very water I was trying to avoid? All around me was murky darkness, and there was no indication that I was even in the basement anymore. It felt like I was floating in the murky lake of the motel. As my consciousness began to fade, Hector quickly jumped in after me and grabbed me by my leg. He then proceeded to quickly twist my ankle. In a split second, my eyes shot open, and the hallucinations that I'd been having dissipated in front of me. I was still submerged in water, but this time I knew exactly where I was, near the surface of the water at the lake, surrounded by grey faces and moss. I was face to face with whatever dragged me in. I cried out in severe pain and snapped back into reality, swallowing a bunch of water in the process, and the only reason I didn't drown in a panic was because Hector was by my side, pulling me away from the creature and snapping me back to reality. My throat burned from the water, and I tried to make an effort to refrain from swallowing any more. Now I could see the creature in all its monstrosity. A brief glimpse was all it took for me to shudder. It was hard to make out uber-specific details given that the water was murky and I was busy focusing on not drowning, but I saw all I needed to see. The creature looked like an old wizened crone, with greyish-blue skin wrinkled from being underwater for so long. Its witch-like, crooked nose was covered in warts, and its yellow, baggy eyes stared helplessly as it shrunk away into the depths of the water. It was covered in moss, seaweed, and other lake debris, which made the rest of its features difficult to see. But it opened its mouth, and I saw anglerfish-like teeth jutting out from its face, much like the teeth I saw in my hallucinations of my parents. From its bony body sprouted thin, tendril-like limbs that stretched out and connected to the faces concealed by the moss. The many frozen faces within its body stared back at me, expressions now peaceful instead of being contorted in pain and shock. As Hector swam us away from the monster, I saw the face of the little boy that had initially lured me in, staring at me with those dead eyes behind his swimming goggles. "You're really fucking annoying, you know that?" Hector grumbled. He carried me back to the room on his back, both of us soaking wet from the lake. I was still coughing up water, and Hector made a sound of annoyance. "Did I or did I not warn you to not leave the goddamned room? I left for less than a minute, and you got yourself into a huge mess. How many times do I have to warn you about shit before you actually listen to me? I'm sorry, okay? You're right, I should have listened to you." I sighed, regretting my stupid decision to jump outside to save what I thought was a little kid, despite Hector's clear warnings. "But couldn't you just, I don't know, punch me or something to snap me out of it, instead of twisting my fucking ankle?" My ankle throbbed in pain despite the coldness settling into my bones. I was definitely going to have to stay off my ankle for a while, maybe even see a doctor for it. Those things are nasty, and this one in particular had a pretty good grip on you. That's how it gets you. It lures you in with something it knows will drag you to its lair, traps you in your thoughts, and fucks you up by exposing you to your darkest fears, by probing into your subconscious. I tried slapping you awake in the water, but you didn't budge. You're lucky all it took to snap you out of it was twisting your ankle. Hector replied. I gulped, not wanting to think about what would have happened to me had Hector not intervened. I most likely would have ended up like those faces in the lake, trapped in unending fear forever. Well, thanks for always saving my ass. I said as Hector kicked open the door to our room. I shivered from the cold, trying not to sound bitter, but having your life endangered does that to a person. They're always looking for another soul to have. They're lonely and want company, but they end up killing humans in the process. They're harmless on their own and can't physically hurt you, but they trap you in your thoughts, so you drown in real time and can't ever escape. You'd be stuck in that nightmarish hell forever. Hector let me down gently onto the bed, making sure to avoid grazing my ankle. He grabbed a big towel from the bathroom and tossed it to me, and quickly arranged the pillows to elevate my ankle. I dried myself off as Hector rummaged through my duffel and handed me some clothes to change into. So the monster was bringing out my fears to trap me in the water, and I would have been trapped there forever? Yep, everything you saw was a product of your own subconscious. Amy, Naomi, drowning, your parents melting into creepy human puddles. The deeper you fall into your fears, the easier it is for the monster to keep you in. All those faces you saw connected to its limbs were people who fell victim to its games, and unfortunately, their souls will never make it out of there until the monster decides it wants to let them go. You're lucky you didn't drown. You actually weren't in the water for more than a few seconds. I coughed up more water, and Hector slapped my back a few times to help me through my coughing fit. I went through a lot more than a few seconds. Yeah, but it's not like I. That was pretty fucking scary, I blurted. Being face to face with your fears like that? And to think, if you weren't there, I would have been stuck in that shit forever. That's not right. I could have died. You wouldn't understand, 'cause you're immortal, but I only have one chance at life. Hector exhaled. I mean, you do have a point. I was a little surprised at how well you've been taking this whole thing, considering you went from not believing in this kind of thing to being thrown into it. The human subconscious is a weird thing. It makes me think, I muttered. If I would have ever went through stuff like this if you weren't here. Hector went silent at that. I immediately regretted the way that sounded. It sounded like I was blaming him when it wasn't entirely his fault that weird stuff was happening to me. It also sounded ungrateful, after he went out of his way to rescue me. But being that I just survived a near-death experience, I paid little attention to filtering my words. Sorry, I don't blame you, he finally said, turning away. I'm gonna shower first. Lake water is so bad for the skin. Hector's original plans were for us to stay at the motel for the entire weekend, just to be safe. But being that my ankle needed immediate medical attention and that I needed to attend my classes for final exams, he reluctantly agreed to bring us back the morning after the debacle. The motorcycle ride back was difficult with a twisted ankle, but luckily, the motel had some immediate first aid, so we could wrap my ankle in a makeshift cast until I got to a bigger hospital. I emailed my professors about the near-death experience, omitting the nightmarish details, of course, and my twisted ankle, and they were willing to give me an extension for projects and exams. I thanked my lucky stars for that, at least. I have to admit, as much as Hector's presence did put me in danger, I also felt a sense of relief from his presence. It was weird. His very being was putting me into these whack situations, but I still felt safer with him around. I couldn't really explain it. With Hector being such a prominent figure in my life, I guess I fell into a habit of complacency and casual banter whenever he was around. I knew I had to apologize to him for somewhat blaming him for everything that had happened, but it felt to me like one of those awkward things that you don't really bring up again. The ride back was awkward and silent enough, and after a couple of days, things went back to normal, so I didn't mention it, and neither did he. It never occurred to me that one day, Hector would have to leave. I truly didn't realize the end was nearing before we knew it, but I wish I had. I was in a good mood when returning from school that night. The final exam wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, and despite everything that happened, I still managed to get in a lot of studying. I even ended an hour earlier than I expected to, which, in retrospect, may not have been an indicator of a good grade, but all that mattered was that the exam was over and I could finally catch a little break. And I really needed this break. I had been tired and exhausted lately, and I needed to catch up on sleep. I even bought fried chicken from Church's to celebrate with Hector. My ankle was also healing well. I had a slight limp when walking, but I didn't have to use crutches for long before I could just walk with a cast on. I never expected to come back from school to see Hector's head in a sack and his hands in what looked to be golden handcuffs, with 5 figures surrounding him, trying to get Hector to stop thrashing around. All 5 figures were in hooded robes, but I could immediately tell they were not human. Instead of heads, the figures all seemed to be big, unblinking eyeballs shrouded in rounded hoods. They had red veins popping at all times and looked to be wet to the touch. They all turned towards me, then towards each other, seemingly confused. I couldn't really tell if they were confused or not, because they were literal floating eyeballs in hoods, but body language says a lot. The tallest figure of all was not an eyeball, but a pair of lips that seemed to be floating in the hood. The pair of lips looked ancient and shriveled, chapped everywhere, like it belonged to a wizened witch rather than a youthful individual. It had a gigantic book in its hand that looked older than my grandfather, and the eyeballs, if I could read eyeballs' emotions, that is, looked genuinely surprised at my arrival. Hector made a sound of urgency. He sounded like he was gagged and couldn't form proper words. "Ah, Finn Conway, I did not expect you here for another 36 minutes and 22 seconds, but so good of you to join us anyway. We're running on a tight schedule as is." Watching a gigantic pair of lips speak was honestly not the strangest thing I'd seen, but it was still quite unsettling. It also had the most normal voice I'd ever heard, also unsettling, considering the voice was coming out from a literal pair of lips. "Yeah, well, exams ended early. Who are you and what are you doing in my house?" I demanded. "And why does Hector look like he's being kidnapped?" "Oh, because he is." The mouth replied, shutting his book. My eyes widened. What was going on? "What?" I turned to Hector, then to the mouth. "What are you talking about? And seriously, who are you? Perhaps you'd be more familiar with this form of mine." As soon as I blinked, the pair of lips and all of the eyeballs were replaced with Daniel, the first person who responded to my Craigslist ad, and the first person I interviewed to be a potential roommate. I opened my mouth to speak, but he put up his hand to interrupt me. "Before you ask questions, you can just continue to refer to us collectively as Daniel, because my true identity would be inconceivable to you. Put simply, I am what you humans would call your guardian angel. I am from the high courts of heaven, and I uphold the law as the delivery of what keeps the universe in balance. My eyes are always on the lookout for any potential glitches in the system, so to speak." Daniel motioned to the other figures, who quickly reverted back to being floating eyeballs with hoods. Their unblinking mannerisms were extremely strange. To you, we may seem like separate parts, but that is not the case. We are all one in the same. These eyes judge, and I, as the mouth, deliver the verdict. I exist to make sure you live your lifeline out to where you were destined to be. I am there to make sure your lives do not exceed nor fail to meet your deadlines, and that nothing gets in the way of it. But being that I am not entirely omnipotent, and I have billions of other humans to watch over, I can only really drop by and check in when you are in grave danger. And this demon, Daniel gestured to Hector, who was still trying to squirm away from the figures restraining him, is putting you in grave danger simply by exposing you to the truth of the universe, which you should not be learning as a mere mortal human. Hector's muffled yells got louder and louder in his head sack. In another blink of an eye, Daniel reverted back to the pair of lips from before. "I am terribly overworked as is, but I got word of the demon's whereabouts in this area around the same time you began your interviews for a new roommate. Unfortunately, my timing was off, and I was not able to interrupt your meeting. When we had the interview, I was really checking in on a tip-off of the exiled demon." Daniel wasn't real? I recalled the supernormal interview with the seemingly supernormal, aspiring chemist Daniel, and couldn't remember anything that would have suggested him being anything but what he said he was. Hector was shaking his head and yelling as if to say, "No, he wasn't. Now can you help me out here?" Figuratively speaking, Daniel was not what you were looking for in a roommate. The mouth concluded. I squeezed my temples. This was beginning to feel a lot like a headache. "Okay, pause. So what you're saying is that you know exactly when I'm supposed to die or whatever, and Hector's presence has been messing around with my original deadline. Yes, it is all in the book. The book is law, and I uphold and embody the law. Mouth Daniel motioned to the ancient book he was holding. On closer inspection, it was dog-eared throughout, and he had his thumb lodged between specific pages, as if to keep track of where he was. You uphold and embody the law. I repeated slowly. Indeed. All right, and you also said you'd drop by if I were in grave danger, but where were you when I was basically kidnapped against my will? That doesn't sound like following the law to me, I said bitterly, being careful about my word selection. I knew this may not have been the right time or place, but if I really had a guardian angel this whole time, why was he absent when the Amy situation happened? Excuse me? It should be in that book of yours. You know, when I got kidnapped by my stalker Amy and was almost forced to marry her at gunpoint. Mouth Daniel waved me off. It is understandable that you were thrown off by those turn of events, but I can assure you that was not life-threatening in the least. Fact, you would have lived a long life under her care, well into your 80s. Initially, you would have resisted, flabbergasted by the proclamation of her emotions. But then, you would have realized how devoted she was to you and came around. You would have eventually fallen in love with her. Man, that's not love, that's Stockholm Syndrome. You would have really been okay with me living a life that I never wanted to? I scoffed. I couldn't believe what Mouth Daniel was spewing out of his, well, mouth. Some guardian angel you are. Finn Conway, you are sorely mistaken. My job is not to ensure you live a life of the utmost quality. What I exist to ensure is the quantity of your life and see that the laws are being followed. And quantity-wise, your lifeline has been a series of tangles and loops ever since this demon entered your life. At one point, you were supposed to die a few days ago, and at another point, your life was extended to beyond what a mere mortal could live until you would have quite literally made history. This is not how it should have been. And that is what I am here to fix, to clean up the mess the demon made and to right the wrongs of your lifeline. So it would have been fine with you if I ended up living a miserable lie of a life. Again, I only uphold and embody the law. What you do in your life is none of my concern. Mouth Daniel's eerie calm demeanor was beginning to get on my nerves, but before I could retort, he interrupted me again. But that is not all that I seek to uphold and embody. Your lifeline is one of many, but your world is still one of its kind. He materialized a small black object from his palm. He held up the black box-looking object, and I quickly realized it was a GoPro. But there was only one reason someone like Mouth Daniel would be showing me a GoPro in this situation. Are you aware of what this is? I gulped. I had a feeling I knew where this was going. A camera? Yes, Mouth Daniel said, crushing the camera between his fingers. His fingers resembled golden daggers, and his hand as a whole was comprised of 6 of those golden digits. What was left of the camera then spontaneously combusted into a flame and melted away in Mouth Daniel's floating palm. The palm of his hand displayed a small holographic visual of a staticky third-party recording of what had gone down in the Pollack's household. This was hidden between the bookshelves of Mabel Pollack's room, carefully placed so a recording of the exorcism could be captured without the camera being seen by anybody. If it weren't for us, the Pollack family would have figured out the truth and possibly caused the recording to go viral on the internet. I cursed myself for not being more careful. I didn't even think to check the room for any cameras because I didn't think Chris would actually try and record the exorcism. Thank God the video didn't get out. I also felt somewhat betrayed by Chris. We never even gave permission for him to record the exorcism, much less witness it in the first place. This is precisely what I am talking about. Not only is the demon's presence affecting your own lifeline, its very presence is disrupting the balance between our worlds, and this should not happen. Had this video gotten out, our PR department would have had an extremely difficult time trying to convince people online that this video was a hoax. Scenes like these are difficult to fake, even though human visual effects have made huge developments. Mouth Daniel then directed his attention back to Hector, who was still struggling against the eyeballs keeping him in the sack. The pair of lips made a nodding motion, and the eyeballs immediately stopped trying to restrain Hector. One of them uncovered his head from the sack and ripped out the rag in his mouth, avoiding Hector's gasps for breaths and coughs. His face was battered and bruised, and he was bleeding profusely from his mouth. I knew he didn't handle pain the same way as a human would, but it still looked extremely painful. One of Mouth Daniel's eyeballs floated to the book, opened it, and began scanning it as Mouth Daniel continued to speak. "You have violated several rules. You damaged purgatory spirits, eradicated and consumed a fellow brethren, helped human Mabel Pollack cheat death by your brethren, and lengthened her lifeline beyond what it should have been, and you still have not showed up for your judicial hearing for your original crime. Your presence has affected this human, and the human now knows more than it ever should have. The human's timeline is damaged and must be reset to where it should have been from the start," Mouth Daniel declared. "Also, profiting off fake exorcisms? Really?" Hector shrugged. "I had to pay rent," Mouth Daniel sighed. "Well, you know what is coming to you. As the keeper of the law, I declare that you will be held accountable for the betrayal of your kind and breaking various rules while here in the mortal's realm. You can't just waltz in here and decide that on your own." I grabbed Daniel's arm. There was nothing to grab. There was only fabric. I immediately retracted my hand, appalled by the emptiness I felt. Clearly, otherworldly creatures' bodies didn't work the same way human bodies did. Shivers ran down my spine. "Actually, I can. I am the law," Daniel retorted. I cringed at the pair of lips and crossed my arms. The eyeballs moved to cover Hector again, who protested by trying to kick their lack of a body. Needless to say, it didn't work. "At least hear Hector out," I pleaded. "He clearly has his own reasons for doing things." "Let the demon try and defend itself," Daniel nodded reluctantly. The eyeballs paused in their movements. "Thanks for the golden opportunity. I would have explained earlier if you didn't ambush me and tie me up like this." Hector sighed, gesturing to his beat-up face. "I made a contract with the human. I'm legally bound to protect him until he dies." The eyeballs spun in place, in what I thought was an eye-rolling motion, and Mouth Daniel snapped his fingers, ordering the eyeballs to mute Hector again by putting on the mouth gag. This was obviously not what he wanted to hear. Hector flailed and protested against his restraints. "You made a contract? With this human? Don't make me laugh, there is no way." "Actually, yeah." I shot up in my seat, coming to my senses. Everyone's focus was on me now, and I knew I couldn't stop. I knew what would help get Hector out of this mess, and it was something he had been mentioning for a long time. Everything he did was to keep me safe from danger, and isn't that a valid reason for him to have had broken all those rules? Yeah, he may have thrown me into a bunch of danger simply by existing, but he also protected me from those dangers. It was to uphold our contract. I hoped this was going in the right direction, because I was saying what immediately came to mind. Every crime he committed in my world was to keep me safe. "And where is this contract?" Mouth Daniel demanded. Does it have to be a physical contract? Can't it just be word of mouth?" "Without physical evidence, we have no reason to pursue this revelation." I thought for a moment, then rushed over to my room. "Hold up," I mumbled as I rummaged through my desk, through the mess of papers, until I found a fried chicken, oil-stained roommate contract that we signed when Hector moved in. It contained a bunch of jargon about the lease and the responsibilities of a roommate, and also Hector's special edition of fried chicken on Fridays in exchange for protection of my soul. My name was signed on the bottom of the confirmation page, and Hector opted to put his bloody fingerprint instead, because he thought that was how contracts were supposed to be formed. I handed the forms over to Eyeball Daniel, who had followed me in. Eyeball Daniel snatched it from me and took it back to the others to discuss the forms. As they contemplated in silence, I sat by Hector, who looked tired and beaten. "Are they talking?" "Yeah, you just can't hear them. It's like a psychic conversation." "I don't suppose I can help you out with those cuffs," I murmured, trying not to attract so much attention from the Daniels. Hector shook his head. "Nah, this is made up of material you humans will never be able to discover. It's fine, it's just a little uncomfortable." he assured. I nodded. I hope I didn't make things worse with the whole contract thing. I don't think it was in his book of law or whatever. I hesitated, looking down at my hands. Hector nudged me with his knee. Are you kidding? You really saved my ass back there by bringing up the contract. Here's a secret. That book isn't 100% right all the time, and it takes some time to update with newer information. It's kind of like Wikipedia. That's probably why they didn't know about the roommate agreement, because they tend to miss little details like that from time to time. They really didn't believe me when I told them because they think I lie a lot, but they had no choice but to believe you, since you're a human. I don't know if that'll fly in the end. It definitely won't excuse everything I did before coming here, but it will help me out with everything I did for you. Everything you did before coming here, huh? All this because you refused to eat humans? Might have been easier to just eat our souls and be done with it, I asked. Hector stared at me, then let out a short laugh. Wait. I never did tell you the real reason why I'm in so much trouble, did I? Hector said, fidgeting with his restraints. It was my turn to stare. Excuse me? Yeah, all that about being kicked out of hell for refusing to eat humans? I wasn't lying about the refusing to eat humans part. I'm genuinely sick of eating humans and wanted to branch out. Sure, it got me dirty looks in the streets, but it's not a violation of a law or anything. It's just an unpopular way of life. Hector shrugged. I told you it was complicated last time you asked, and I just didn't feel like a highway was the right time or place to tell you the whole story. I was never kicked out of hell, so to speak. I'm sure you could tell from what that mouth was flapping. I was avoiding my arrest warrant for committing an actual crime. Wait, so you were lying to me? I mean, I wanted to make a good first impression at the roommate interview. I wanted to be cool. Being kicked out of hell was the coolest thing I could think of. Hector gnawed at the handcuffs, to no avail. Also, I thought it was pretty self-explanatory. How is that even remotely for? How is that supposed to make a good impress, Jude? You told me you were kicked out for refusing to eat humans. I sputtered. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If refusing to eat humans wasn't Hector's crime, then what was? Why would I be condemned to hell prison for a diet preference? That's so George Orwell. You'd really believe anything I say. Well, I had no reason to believe otherwise. Everything you said was crazy enough for me to just come to accept. What's the real reason you're in this mess, then? I demanded. We've come this far, and you're about to be arrested, so you might as well be straight with me for once. Hector was silent, his gaze falling on the figures who were still conversing, probably within their own psychic realm or whatever. I made a deal under the table with a soul I was supposed to torture, Hector finally said. You're already aware this isn't my body. I never told you the details, though. This is Hector Sanchez, and he died when he was 27 back in 1922. Grew up poor, mom died when he was born. Left with only a sister who died of polio when he was 12, and a father who struggled to make ends meet. Worked as a paperboy and earned pennies, stole a lot to eat when his dad couldn't feed him. But they had a lot of debt from a lot of past mistakes. Hector went to hell for killing 3 mobsters because he thought those people were the mobsters who were threatening his family for their debt. Turns out, he pissed off a whole other group of mobsters who murdered him in cold blood after finding out that their own were killed by him. And he never got justice for the debt he never deserved. He ended up in hell because he killed the wrong people at the wrong time, wrong place. That doesn't sound fair. Life's not fair. You know that. Why hit up a deal with him specifically? Why not all the other souls you've tortured in your lifetime? Well, Hector grinned. I liked his name. My jaw slacked. That's it? Yeah. Aren't there a million Hectors out there? Yeah, but this one happened to be tortured at the right time, right place, by the right guy. Me, despite me always skinning him, only to put the skin back on his body to do it all over again. He told me his life story, and I listened. This was around the time where I decided to go on my non-human binge. Then I thought, why not borrow this guy's body and identity and go to his world to try all the foods he always mentioned back when he was alive? Long story short, I snuck his soul to purgatory while I borrowed his identity to fuck around in your world. couldn't send him to heaven because they have a lot of security guards there, but purgatory beats hell by a long shot. That sounds super illegal, and I'm not even familiar with your laws. Look, everything isn't always black and white. I never really approved of the way these tight asses threw bad guys in heaven and good guys in hell, just because of the way their books told them they should do it. Hector Sanchez didn't die a fair death, and he sure as hell didn't live a fair life. The odds were always stacked against him. I'd like to think what I did was morally right, which, actually, kind of goes against everything I'm supposed to stand for. I exhaled slowly. This was a lot to take in at once, but this time I knew Hector had no reason to be fabricating anything, seeing as he was in a tough situation now. The more I thought about it, the more I saw things from his perspective. The real Hector Sanchez really was disadvantaged from the start. He never would have went through that if we were born into a family with better luck, better wealth, and better status. I wondered if cases like Hector's was common, things that led souls to be wrongfully incarcerated to hell just because they broke some laws that were 1,000,000 years old and clearly not adapted to changing times. It sounded all too similar to certain criminal laws we had on Earth, and I realized maybe hell and Earth weren't so different after all. You know, you're right. And for a demon, you're really not as bad as you make your kind out to be, I remarked. I mean, maybe it's just you and every other demon just sucks, but you're more human than demon in my eyes. We exchanged tense smiles. Hey, after a few centuries this demon thing gets really old. The arrest was worth the execution. Execution? Oh yeah, I'm most likely going to get the human equivalent of a death sentence and be eradicated in the flames of hell forever for what I did. My jaw dropped as the Daniels turned around, seemingly reaching an agreement. We have taken the words of this physical contract into consideration. The contract is valid. Mouth Daniel finally said. Hector looked ecstatic, and I breathed a sigh of relief. However, Mouth Daniel cut off our celebration. Seeing as the situation is somewhat paradoxical in that he caused the very problems he was protecting you from, this must be submitted to the higher courts for further inspection. In addition, he will still be facing trial for his crimes of sending a guilty soul to purgatory. I deflated. What? How is that fair? It is just. I am the law, Mouth Daniel insisted. We get it. You're the fucking law. Hector slumped back in his seat. So what now? Mouth Daniel closed the book, and the book disappeared from between his hands. Now that the demon is in our custody, we will be taking the demon back to our realm where he will be tried. But I will say, the contract was compelling and may help dispel some crimes here, even if it was paradoxical. I drowned out Mouth Daniel's words as I realized what was awaiting Hector. Here, courts really showed no mercy in cases with people who were disadvantaged from the start. A lot of undeserving people got death sentences for cases that should have been reviewed better, and it really seemed like Hector was not going to get a good outcome. Despite the contract couldn't save him from a guilty verdict, and what usually followed guilty verdicts wasn't good. I couldn't stand to hear Hector being forced to attend an unfair trial and potentially get executed. I stood in front of him, immobile and firm. So you're just going to execute him because he did something that went against your book? Have you ever considered the fact that your book is wrong? Because from what he tells me, it's not always updated 100%, and it really doesn't account for all the injustices that the real Hector Sanchez faced when he was sent to hell in the first place. And you said so yourself that you're not omnipotent, so how am I supposed to believe your book is absolute? I stormed. The book is absolute, and I will not dispute that with a human. Your feeble mind will never be able to comprehend the sheer vastness of the contents of this book, which contains the answers to questions you humans will never be able to know despite seeking profusely. But I never said anything about execution, Mouth Daniel remarked, sounding confused. Aren't you taking him to trial? You guys have been implying Hector's guilty, and I'm assuming he's going to get executed or something down there when the trial doesn't work out in his favor. I stammered, realizing Hector duped me again. One last horror before he left. He will not be executed per se. His crime is not of that caliber. He will have to perform what you humans equate to as community service, But execution requires a far greater crime, and he has not committed that. Hector laughed obnoxiously in the background. Dude, did you really think I was going to get executed? Where the fuck did you get that idea? Shut up, I said, turning red at my mistake. You really wanted to screw around one last time, huh? You guys really made this whole thing sound horrible and beyond repair. It is horrible. The demon disrupted the balance of the universe and messed with your timeline, which will take some time to get back to normal. Mouth, Daniel interrupted. You made it sound horrible enough for an execution, I retorted. How am I supposed to know what punishments fit the crime in your book? Mouth, Daniel interrupted again. Higher beings really needed to learn some manners. All I want to know is, why? Why would you want to confine yourself to a mortal life, escape trial, rather than face a sentence that would be more of an inconvenience than an execution? Instead, you chose to take the more difficult route and avoid your responsibilities. All we do down there is torture souls and eat humans. It gets old after a couple of centuries, and I got bored. I wanted to try something new. Is that so bad? Hector shrugged. By doing this, you have single-handedly upset the already tedious balance between us and the humans, and exposed their world to even more calamities from hell, purgatory, and heaven. You have potentially shortened and lengthened Finn Conway's lifespan to ridiculous degrees by making him aware of our worlds and vice versa. Hector was silent for a moment. Well, when you put it that way, it does sound pretty bad enough for an execution. And I must remind you that you will still be held accountable for the... Yeah, I know. Soul to purgatory bad, torture souls forever good. Hector sarcastically drawled. The Daniels nodded and took off their hoods. They all simultaneously turned into human Daniels again. We will be waiting outside this building for you. We will take another portal back to hell. This one will be eradicated. Daniel walked over to where Amy had carved the summoning circle into the floor and put his palm over the grooved ridges. In one smooth swipe, the circle disappeared and the wood was back to normal before Amy defiled it with her insanity. With his other palm, Daniel produced a small black duffel bag which he threw onto Hector's lap. Please pack lightly and only what you need. We will see you in no more than 15 minutes. Wait, Hector stopped them. What about him? He pointed to me. What about me? Isn't it protocol to wipe his memory or whatever? Hector asked. I gaped at him. I didn't want my memories wiped. The last thing I needed were gaps in my memory from a brain reboot. We cannot. There would be too much of a discrepancy between his memory loss and his true memories if we were to tamper with his mind at this point. It is far too late. It could put him in even further danger of a shorter timeline. No one will believe him anyway. This does come off as preposterous to most humans. Cool. Good for you, Finn. You get to remember every little thing that happened to you. Hector nudged me. I glared at him. With that, all of the Daniels walked out of the apartment. I debated telling them how weird it looked that they were all essentially the same person in different clothes, but figured people would just pass them off as quintuplets or something. They were the least of my concerns in that moment. Well, Hector got up once the restraints melted off his wrists. He stretched his back and yawned. That's that. It's been a great run. Sorry you have to find another roommate again. You can keep whatever's left of the fake exorcism money. I don't need it where I'm going. Hector rummaged around the apartment, beginning to pack up. So that's it, I said. You're really leaving? Just like this? Not because I want to, obviously. But you heard the eyeballs. I got a blast. There's no point in running anymore. They have me cornered, and I'd rather just deal with this shit now before it gets any worse. Guess that means I have to find another place, I murmured. Now that there's no stalker following me where I live, I don't have to live with a roommate out of fear for my life anymore. And hey, the lease will end soon, so I wouldn't be breaking any contracts. I realized the irony of my statement shortly after I said it. Hey, at least one of us benefited from contracts, right? Hector commented. He seemed to ponder what to bring back and contemplated the amount of room he had in his small bag. He ended up only packing his fryer and the fried chicken I brought back into the duffel bag he was provided. Those were the only things that he wanted to take back to hell before his trial. Knowing it was the last of his things made me feel a pang of guilt. I crossed my arms. "If the trial goes well, will I ever see you again?" I asked. The strange feeling of sadness was beginning to set in. Though these has been the wildest weeks I had been through in my entire life, I knew that I would feel a void where Hector and his strange fried chicken-loving self were. And I had to admit, Hector grew on me in the short time we had together. "No, probably not. I'm most likely going to be confined to torture duty for at least a couple centuries for what I did," he said. I looked downcast, and Hector laughed. Kidding. I'm telling you, it's no big deal. You're definitely going to see me again," Hector assured. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The trial's not going to be that bad. At least, I hope. I'm really hoping I'll only be held accountable for what my crimes back down in hell. If I get a good enough lawyer to represent me, they'll be able to sleaze the contract into freeing me from any crimes committed while with you. The best lawyers end up in hell, after all. I guess I looked unconvinced, because Hector continued on with his explanation. He put a hand on my shoulder in a reassuring manner. "Look at it this way, man. We're contractually bound until you die. It might be a while, but I'll see you again. We have no cell service in hell, though, so if I do visit, it's going to have to be a surprise." All right. I took his words and chose to trust that we would eventually cross paths again. I uncrossed my arms and stuck my hand out for Hector to shake. "Until next time, then?" Hector glanced at my hand, grabbed it, and pulled me into the most awkward and clumsy hug that I had ever experienced. I was surprised, to say in the least. I had never seen Hector do anything that could have been considered remotely affectionate, so this was strange to me. Hector pat my back tensely, clearly uncomfortable by the gesture that he initiated. This is weird. Hugs are weird. He let go and Hector rubbed his neck nervously, a habit he picked up from me. I saw that people hug in TV when leaving each other for a long time, but now that I've tried it, I have no idea why. It just makes things sadder, and this isn't even the end of things. I nodded in agreement, amused by his discomfort at a simple hug, especially considering he's done worse things. Hector zipped up his duffel bag, and I gazed at the immaculate floorboards, where the summoning circle once was. To think all of this happened because I was careless and put my information online for my stalker to find. As an IT guy, I really should have known better. But my carelessness led to meeting Hector, learning more about the universe than ever, and having weird misadventures with otherworldly creatures in my otherwise boring, law-abiding life. And I managed to stay sane and alive through all of it. If I could have done it all again, I wouldn't have changed a thing. Except maybe my stupid username from the game, Miss Peanut Butter 26. Thanks for everything, Finn. I really had a great time here. You know, for a human, you weren't that bad. Hector smiled at me. Despite his words, his smile felt incredibly sincere this time around, and it was a shame that the one time he showed human-like vulnerability, it was because he was leaving for an unknown amount of time. "I'll see you around," I said, smiling back. "And Hector?" "Yeah? Sorry for, saying I wouldn't have ever went through this stuff if you weren't here. You've been through a lot, and that was selfish of me to say, especially when you saved my life. Even though you caused it, I guess. My life's been more exciting than it's ever been since you came, and I don't want you to leave thinking I hated you." "Apology accepted. I knew you didn't hate me. You worry about the weirdest shit." I rolled my eyes. Hector took one last look around the apartment, and then at me before closing the door gently behind him. I heard the rustle of his duffel hitting his leg as he walked away into the hallway, until I heard nothing else but silence. In a nutshell, I had a really strange time with Hector, but it was exciting nonetheless. I don't know when he'll come back and how he'll manage to stay out of trouble, but I knew he would figure out a way somehow. And when he did, I would treat him to more fried chicken places. Maybe even take him on a trip to Louisiana so he can get some of that genuine fried chicken experience. I have a feeling this isn't the end of our encounters with one another, and despite everything, I'm glad I met Hector. His fried chicken-loving presence is always welcome at my place, wherever I end up moving to. All in all, thanks for following me in my strange misadventures, guys. It's been a wild ride. I promise I'll keep you updated if Hector ever visits again, and when he does, I'm sure strange happenings will follow once more.
That's the end of this story. If you found it engaging, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this.